Hey everybody, as of the time I'm writing this, Israel has killed more than 34,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians. And they've displaced far, far more than that, leaving millions of people in extreme danger and without sufficient aid. These acts can conservatively be called war crimes, a fact so obvious I hardly feel the need to say it. Still, just a few hours ago, news came out of a possible ceasefire being brokered, and I am hopeful. Hopeful that the killings of the present moment can end, and hopeful that maybe we can finally construct some kind of lasting peace, an end to the debilitating blockades, the poverty, and the daily humiliations that have pervaded the lives of Palestinians for so long. At any rate, recently in the United States, a number of high-profile college campuses started protesting Israel's actions, the most notable of these protests, of course, being Columbia, where a number of student protesters were suspended and arrested. Just a fun fact, I actually went out to the Columbia protests for a few hours. My friends snuck me onto the campus. Conveniently for me, a good number of students actually recognized me, so I got to talk to them, and I have to tell you, from my perspective, they seemed just aggressively normal. They were just nice young people who were protesting in obvious injustice. Anyway, given my narrow personal experience, I have to say I was a bit surprised to read some of the opinion pieces generated about these Columbia students by America's most prestigious newspapers. Some of these guys seem to think these students weren't nice, weren't normal, but were instead violent and nasty. So there's a few of these articles I could talk about, but I decided to focus on one because it is, frankly, just a bit of a goldmine. I'm going to respond to John McWhorter's New York Times opinion piece, "I'm a Columbia professor. The protests on my campus are not justice." This is a very, very podcasty video, by the way. Don't feel the need to look at this one. Nothing much is going to happen on the screen. And with that, I guess we'll just get into it. McWhorter writes, "Last Thursday, in the music humanities class I teach at Columbia University, two students were giving an in-class presentation on the composer John Cage. His most famous piece is 433, which directs us to listen in silence to surrounding noise for exactly that amount of time. I had to tell the students we could not listen to that piece that afternoon because the surrounding noise would have not been birds or people walking by in the hallways, but infuriated chanting from protesters outside the building. Lately, that noise has been almost continuous during the day and into the evening, including lusty chanting of 'From the River to the Sea.' Two students in my class are Israeli, three others, to my knowledge, are American Jews. I couldn't see making them sit and listen to this as if it were background music." So, the first two paragraphs of this article tell a fun vignette about how this poor professor couldn't teach John Cage 433, and I guess there's a few things we could say about this. I could meditate on 433 and its meaning for a little while, but I'm not going to do that because blatantly the only reason this professor invokes this piece of silent music is to get at the basic point: it's too noisy out there. I'm sorry, could we be a little less loud? I can't even hear the birds with all your chanting. Free speech is free speech, but this has gone too far. What with all the noise? McWhorter continues, "I thought about what would have happened if protesters were instead chanting anti-black slogans, or even something like DEI has got to die to the same sound-off tune that 'From the River to the Sea' has been adapted to. They would have lasted roughly 5 minutes before the masses of students shouted them down and drove them off the campus. Chants like that would have been condemned as a grave rupture of civilized exchange, heralded as threatening resegregation, and branded as a form of violence. I'd wager that most of the student protesters against the Gaza war would view them that way. Why do so many people think that weeks-long campus protests against not just the war in Gaza, but Israel's very existence are nevertheless permissible?" So over the course of his career, McWhorter has written a number of articles like this, the Know Nothing Campus Protest Movement. Articles where he gets mad at students for protesting conservative speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos, where he talks about echo chambers and how awful they are, where he talks about the importance of free speech. And because of that, I think, McWhorter now feels he has to play the part of someone who's, merely pointing out hypocrisy. Why would you guys dislike bad racism on campus, but be okay with pro-Palestine, anti-Israel discourse on campus? You guys don't make any sense. You're phonies. So what we're seeing here, basically, is McWhorter assuming his beliefs as fact rather than attending to the merits of the argument. He doesn't have to argue that anti-Israel advocacy is just as bad as white supremacist advocacy. He just kind of assumes it with a what if. What if they were the same? But perhaps that's unfair. In the following paragraphs, he tries to add just a bit of nuance to the conversation. He writes, "Although I know many Jewish people will disagree with me, I don't think that Jew hatred is as much the reason for this sentiment as opposition to Zionism and the war on Gaza. I know some of the protesters, including a couple who were taken to jail last week, and I find it very hard to imagine that they are anti-Semitic. Yes, there can be a fine line between questioning Israel's right to exist and questioning Jewish people's right to exist, and yes, some of the rhetoric amid the protest crosses it. Pro-Palestinian rallies and events, of which there have been many here over the years, are not in and of themselves hostile to Jewish students, faculty, and staff members. Disagreement will not always be a juice and cookies affair." So I guess that seems okay. I have some problems with his language, but it's an okay start. But let's see how he follows it up. However, the relentless assault of this current protest, daily louder into the night, and using ever angrier rhetoric, is beyond what any people should be expected to bear up under, regardless of their whiteness, privilege, or power. Social media discussion has been claiming that the protests are peaceful. They are, some of the time. It varies by location and day. Generally, what goes on within the campus gates is somewhat less strident than what happens just outside of them, but relatively constant are the drum beats. People will differ on how peaceful that sound can ever be, just as they will differ on the nature of anti-Semitism. Wow, that's a lot, isn't it? A lot going on there. So this article is ostensibly about the injustice of current Columbia protests. That is the name of the piece. And thus far, 7 paragraphs in, the only injustice that he's pointed to is that the protesters are loud. It's the John Cage defense again. He writes in this extremely weak way too, at least in these paragraphs. People will differ on how peaceful that sound can ever be. But of course, the protests are peaceful, and that's true even though they chant and make a lot of noise. In fact, the very insinuation that protesters chanting is itself violent is essentially making the argument that there is no such thing as a peaceful protest. This is, after all, what protesters do. They yell slogans and sing songs and hit drums. If you can't allow for that, then you just think protests are intrinsically violent. Which, and I have to emphasize this, is fucking dumb and useless as a claim. The NYPD itself has better standards than this. They claim that the students they arrested were being peaceful. But to be fair, I guess the loud noises just really frightened McWhorter, and perhaps even made him piss his pants out of raw terror. Maybe he pissed himself. Anyway, it's easy to see through McWhorter's bullshit as he continues to write this. What I do know is that even the most peaceful of protests would be treated as outrages if they were interpreted as, say, anti-black, even if the message were coded as in a bunch of people quietly holding up MAGA signs or wearing t-shirts saying all lives matter. So yeah, obviously his problem with these protesters is not really what they do. That will become increasingly obvious, I promise you. His problem is with their message. He disagrees with them, he doesn't like the things they're saying, and he'd like for them to be made to stop. The issue there, though, is that if he just said that out loud, he'd reveal himself to be a fundamentally illiberal actor who disdains free speech even as he pretends to celebrate it. So, he lies and calls the speech he doesn't like violence. A very clever trick. I imagine that McWhorter's largely dumb baby readership would be swayed by it. Maybe I'm being unfair here, though. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, because in the very next paragraph, McWhorter finally tries to persuade us that what's happening during these Columbia protests is violence. Like, he finally gives us examples. And besides, calling all of this peaceful stretches the use of the word rather implausibly. It's an odd kind of peace when a local rabbi urges Jewish students to go home as soon as possible, when an Israeli Arab activist is roughed up on Broadway, when the angry chanting becomes so constant that you almost start to not hear it, and it starts to feel normal to see posters and clothing portraying members of Hamas as heroes. Okay, so let's go through this list of 3 things one by one. McWhorter McWhorter's first example is that a local Orthodox rabbi told Jewish students not to come to campus because they might face violence. I don't know if I need to say anything about this, but I guess I have to. Someone warning people that violence might occur is not the same as violence occurring. If I say there may be a chocolate cake in your refrigerator, that doesn't materialize the cake, right? That's not how this works. His second example is that a pro-Israel activist confronting some pro-Palestine protesters got punched in the face by one of those protesters. Now, this is by far McWhorter's most compelling example. I mean, this is obviously a case of violence occurring, and it's honestly a bit strange that he sandwiched this example between two bits of nonsense. There are two problems here, though. The first is, this happened outside of Columbia's campus, so you can't really cite it as an example of the Columbia student protest being violent, and he very much seems to want to claim that it is. Second, I just don't think one isolated case of violence between protesters and counter-protesters is enough to call a massive citywide protest categorically violent. You know, I'd probably feel different if a more serious injury were caused or if a lot of people were getting punched, but as it stands, I just don't think this is a good enough case for the massive claim that McWhorter is trying to make. His third example is that the chanting has become so constant that it starts to feel normal, and you know, we've been here before. We're back to just calling loud people violent. I truly don't understand how one person can milk a truly meaningless talking point for this long. I don't know how to keep responding to it. It's too dumb. McWhorter finishes this paragraph with the following, and it's perhaps the lowest rating I have ever read. The other night, I watched a dad coming from the protest with his little girl, giving a good hard few final snaps on the drum he was carrying, nodding at her in crisp salute, percussing his perspective into her little mind. This is not peaceful. Yep, you heard it here first, folks. It's violent to, it's violent when the child is around people who don't like war crimes. Girl, what the fuck are you talking about? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You're writing this paragraph like you saw the war, like you're writing like you're in the trenches of World War I. Meanwhile, you saw a child with a drumming father. You're so weird. Anyway, let's just keep reading with another slightly more equivocal passage. I understand that the protesters and their fellow travelers feel that all of this is the proper response, social justice on the march. They have been told that righteousness means placing the battle against whiteness and its power front and center, contesting the abuse of power by any means necessary. And I think the war on Gaza is no longer constructive or even coherent. However, the issues are complex in ways that this uncompromising brand of power battling is ill-suited to address. Legitimate questions remain about the definition of genocide, about the extent of a nation's right to defend itself, and about the justice of partition, which has not historically been limited to Palestine. There is a reason many consider the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the most morally challenging in the modern world. So these paragraphs are doing something that I personally like to call Zeno's arrow of moral equivocation. The issue is complicated, so saith McWhorter, and because of its complexity, we can never choose a side and take that side seriously. Don't you see? We can't protest Israel's actions yet. We still have to answer questions about what constitutes a genocide. We still don't know what rights a nation has to defend itself. These kinds of questions, you may notice, can go on for the rest of our lives. They're very philosophical and loose in nature, and I doubt McWhorter would ever come to an answer he was happy with. And because of that, we can just always refuse the possibility of moral conviction. He even says that he doesn't find the Gaza war constructive, and yet the idea of protesting it is still unthinkable to him for some reason. The article is winding down, but we'll just keep reading. We'll keep plumbing the depths. McWhorter writes, when I was at Rutgers in the mid-1980s, the protests were against investment in South Africa's apartheid regime. There were similarities with the Columbia protests now. A large number of students established an encampment site right in front of the Rutgers Student Center on College Avenue, where dozens slept every night for several weeks. Among the largely white crowd, participation was a badge of civic commitment. There was chanting, along with the street theater inevitable and perhaps even even necessary to effective protest. One guy even lay down in the middle of College Avenue to block traffic, taking a page from the Vietnam protests. I don't recall South Africans on campus feeling personally targeted, but the bigger difference was that though the protesters sought to make their point at high volume over a long period, and sometimes even rudely, they did not seek to all but shut down campus life. I don't even know what's going on here. I won't lie to you. Like, he says that in the past he liked the anti-apartheid protests, which were loud and disruptive and which involved one student blocking traffic, and then he attempts to claim that the current Columbia protests aren't like that at all, but his reasons just don't make any sense. The first thing he says is, I don't recall South Africans on campus feeling personally targeted, and it's like, you don't recall them feeling targeted? What do you know? How many South African Rutgers students were you familiar with? There must be 10, 20, 50 times the number of pro-Israel people on Columbia's campus than there were pro-apartheid South Africans on Rutgers campus in the 1980s. And honestly, do you really think those pro-apartheid students didn't feel targeted? Do you think they felt comfortable airing out those beliefs in public? No, spare me. There's no way. The second thing he says is even stranger somehow. The apartheid protesters didn't seek to shut down campus life. Dude, you just said one guy laid down in the middle of traffic. You said they were loud and chanted a lot for weeks. The very same thing that you call violence in the Columbia protests. No, the real difference between these two protests is obvious. So obvious that I have to imagine McWhorter is just lying. He agrees fully with the anti-South Africa advocacy of the 1980s, and he's pretty damn unsympathetic to the anti-Israel advocacy of today. Fucking doy. Okay, let's just finish up with the last two paragraphs. Today's protesters don't hate Israel's government any more than yesterday's hated South Africa's, but they have pursued their goals with a markedly different tenor, in part because of the single-mindedness of anti-racist academic culture, and in part because of the influence of iPhones and social media, which inherently encourage a more heightened degree of performance. It is part of the warp and woof of today's protests that they are being recorded from many angles for the world to see. One speaks up. But these changes in moral history and technology can hardly be expected to comfort Jewish students in the here and now. What began as intelligent protest has become, in its uncompromising fury and its ceaselessness, a form of abuse. A form of abuse. The people protesting are doing an abuse. They're problematic. They're gaslighting me. I can't even teach my precious 433. This is an act of violence. You know, on the topic of violence, you might notice one glaring omission from this opinion piece. The actual violence that occurred during this protest, the 108 peaceful students that were arrested by the NYPD. Students who were detained by force for protesting the Israeli government and its crimes against Gaza. But of course, John McWhorter couldn't mention that, could he? Because he agrees with that violence. Anyway, that's all I have to say. It's 3:15 a.m. as I'm recording this. I wrote this entire thing in the last 2 hours. I don't know why I'm doing this. But I hope you liked it. You know, I hope you enjoyed.